They called her worthless, broken. A mistake born into the wrong bloodline. Tonight, surrounded by wolves who wanted her erased, Lyra Vane made a choice that shattered an empire. And it all started when a king sat down beside the girl no one would look at. If you want to see how one quiet act of defiance brought an entire pack to its knees, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. Let's begin. The Iron Peak Great Hall had never looked more alive. Torches blazed along stone walls slick with centuries of smoke and blood. The scent of roasted meat and wildflowers twisted through the air, mingling with the sharper bite of dominance, wolf musk, territorial and thick. Laughter boomed from the long tables where the pack elite sat shoulder to shoulder, their voices loud, their eyes gleaming with the kind of pride that came from knowing you belonged. Tonight was the mating ceremony. The night Elric Vane, newly crowned alpha of the Iron Peak pack, would solidify his power by choosing a mate worthy of standing beside him. Every unmated she-wolf in the territory had prepared for weeks. They wore their finest, silk, leather, ceremonial furs passed down through generations. They moved like dancers, like warriors, like queens. And tucked into the farthest corner of the hall, invisible beneath the weight of it all, sat Lyra Vane. She didn't belong here. She knew it. They knew it. But tradition demanded that all bloodkin attend, even the broken ones. Lyra kept her head low, her hands folded in her lap, her fingers curled around a small, smooth stone she carried everywhere. It was pale gray, worn soft by years of nervous rubbing, and it had been her mother's once. That was all she had left of her. A stone and a name whispered in pity. Lyra, the wolfless daughter. She could feel the weight of 100 gazes sliding over her and away, as if she were a shadow that didn't deserve acknowledgement. No one spoke to her. No one sat near her. Even the servants who refilled goblets and cleared plates stepped carefully around her chair, as if her bad luck might be contagious. Across the hall, at the head table raised on a stone dais, Elric sat like a monument to everything she wasn't. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair slicked back, and a jaw sharp enough to cut. His eyes, pale gold, like their father's, scanned the room with the cool authority of someone who had never once doubted his place in the world. He wore black and silver, the colors of the Iron Peak Alpha line, and every gesture he made was calculated to remind the room that he was in control. Beside him sat his beta, Marcus Thorne, a man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and a smile that never reached his eyes. And on Elric's other side, draped in crimson silk that clung to every curve, was Seraphine Hale, daughter of the Eastern Pack's warlord, and the woman everyone knew Elric would choose. She was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, sharp, cold, perfectly deadly. Lyra had learned long ago not to compare herself to women like Seraphine. There was no point. She had no wolf, no strength, no voice that mattered. She was a mistake her father had tried to hide and her brother had learned to ignore. Their father, Roland Vane, had been alpha before Elric. A hard man, a traditional man, a man who believed that weakness was a disease that needed to be cut out before it spread. When Lyra had failed to shift on her 13th birthday, the age when every wolf in the pack experienced their first transformation, Roland had looked at her with something worse than anger, disappointment. He had locked her away for 3 days, hoping solitude and fear would trigger what nature had denied her. It hadn't worked. When she emerged, thin and trembling, he'd made his decision. She would be kept, fed, sheltered, but she would never be treated as pack. She was a ghost in her own home. Her mother, Alara, had tried to protect her. Lyra remembered soft hands braiding her hair, whispered lullabies in a language she didn't understand, and the smell of lavender that clung to her mother's skin. But Alara had died when Lyra was 15. A hunting accident, they said. Lyra had never believed it. Wolves didn't have accidents. They had challenges, ambushes, executions disguised as fate. She thought her mother had been killed for loving something the pack considered worthless, and she thought her father had let it happen. Roland had died 2 years later, a heart attack during a territorial dispute, and Elric had ascended without hesitation. He was everything Roland had wanted, strong, ruthless, uncompromising, and he had continued the tradition of keeping Lyra exactly where she'd always been, out of sight, out of mind, out of the way. The ceremony began with a howl. It tore through the hall like thunder, and every wolf in the room tilted their head back and answered. The The sound was primal, layered, a chorus of power that shook the rafters and sent shivers down Lyra's spine. She didn't howl. She couldn't. She had no wolf to call. Instead, she sat in silence, clutching her stone, and waited for it to be over. Elric rose from his seat, and the room fell silent. Brothers, sisters, allies of Iron Peak. His voice was smooth, commanding, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. Tonight, we honor tradition. Tonight, we honor strength. Tonight, I choose the wolf who will stand beside me as we lead this pack into a new era. Applause rippled through the crowd. A few younger wolves whistled. Seraphine smiled, slow and satisfied, already rising from her seat. It was a foregone conclusion. Lyra watched without emotion. She had learned to turn herself into stone during moments like this, to feel nothing, to want nothing. It was the only way to survive. But then, the doors at the far end of the hall exploded open. Not with violence, not with noise, but with presence. Every head turned, the applause died. Even the torches seemed to flicker lower, as if the flames themselves were bowing. And through the doorway, flanked by two silent sentinels in black armor, stepped a man who didn't need to announce himself. Kael Draven, the Lycan King of the North. Lyra had heard stories about him her entire life, whispered around campfires, muttered in fear by wolves who thought themselves untouchable. Kael Draven was not a man you met. He was a force you survived, if you were lucky. He ruled the northern territories with an iron fist and a reputation for absolute brutality. They said he had killed his own father to take the throne. They said he could shift faster than thought, that his wolf was twice the size of any normal Lycan, that his eyes could freeze the blood in your veins. They said he had no mate, no weakness, no mercy. And now he was here. He was taller than anyone in the room, his frame wrapped in dark leather and fur that looked like it had been torn from something ancient and unwilling to die. His hair was black as midnight, falling just past his shoulders, and his eyes, cold, silver, and utterly unreadable, swept across the hall like a predator evaluating prey. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply walked. And the crowd parted like water. Lyra's breath caught. She had never seen anyone move like that. Every step was deliberate, controlled, radiating a kind of quiet power that made the strongest wolves in the room look like children playing dress-up. Elric's expression tightened, but he recovered quickly, stepping forward with his arms spread in a gesture of welcome that looked rehearsed. Kael Draven, he said, his voice pitched to Carrie, we are honored by your presence. Please join us at the head table. We have prepared a seat befitting your status. Kael didn't even glance at him. He walked past the dais, past the elite tables where the strongest wolves sat, past Seraphine, whose smile faltered, past Marcus, whose hand twitched toward the blade at his hip, and he stopped directly in front of Lyra. The hall went silent, not the comfortable silence of anticipation, the suffocating silence of shock. Lyra's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Her fingers tightened around the stone until her knuckles went white. What was he doing? Why was he looking at her? Kael's silver eyes swept over her face, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in their depths. Curiosity, maybe, or calculation. Then without a word, he pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat. The world tilted. Whispers exploded like wildfire. What is he? Sitting with her? The wolfless girl? Is this some kind of insult? Did he lose a bet? Lyra's mouth went dry. She couldn't look at him, couldn't move. Her entire body felt like it was made of glass, one wrong breath away from shattering. This had to be a mistake, a cruel joke, a test. Kael leaned back in his chair, utterly unbothered by the chaos erupting around them, and gestured lazily to one of the servants frozen nearby. Wine, he said. His voice was deep, smooth, edged with the kind of authority that made disobedience unthinkable. The servant stumbled forward, nearly dropping the pitcher, and filled 2 goblets with shaking hands. Kael poured, slid one goblet toward Lyra, and then, in a voice low enough that only she could hear, he said, "Act like you're with me." Lyra's breath hitched. She finally turned her head, just enough to meet his eyes, and the intensity there, calm, deliberate, dangerous, made her throat close. "Why?" she whispered. The word barely made it past her lips. Because, Kael said, his lips barely moving, in about 30 seconds, your brother is going to try very hard to humiliate you in front of this entire room. And I don't feel like watching that tonight. Lyra's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. I don't understand. You don't need to. They'll think. Let them think whatever they want. His tone was almost bored. What matters is what happens next. Before Lyra could respond, before she could process any of this, Elric's voice cut through the noise like a whip. Kael! The Lycan King didn't stand, didn't turn. He simply tilted his head, acknowledging the alpha with the barest flicker of attention. It was a calculated insult, and everyone in the room felt it. Elric descended from the dais, his expression carefully neutral, but Lyra could see the fury simmering beneath the surface. She had grown up reading the micro-expressions that betrayed his moods, the slight twitch of his jaw, the way his fingers curled just a fraction tighter. He was furious, and he was trying very hard not to show it. Forgive me, Elric said, his tone dangerously polite, but I believe there's been some confusion. That seat is not reserved for guests of your stature. Kael took a slow sip of wine, set the goblet down, and looked up at Elric with an expression of mild curiosity. No? His voice was silk over steel. Then perhaps you should invest in better seating arrangements. A few stifled laughs rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed to cover a snort. Elric's jaw tightened. My sister, he said, and the word sister came out like an apology he didn't want to make, is not accustomed to such attention. I'm sure she would be more comfortable elsewhere, perhaps in her quarters, away from the noise. It was a dismissal, a polite command for her to leave. Lyra had heard it 1,000 times before. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't alone. Kael finally looked up at Elric, and when he spoke, his voice was so calm it was almost conversational. Your sister, he said slowly, each word deliberate, seems perfectly comfortable to me. The tension in the room thickened like smoke. Lyra could feel every eye on her, judging, questioning, trying to understand what game was being played and whether she was a piece or a pawn. Marcus stepped forward, his hand now resting openly on the hilt of his blade. His eyes were hard, suspicious. Alpha Draven, he said, his voice tight with barely concealed aggression. With all respect, this is a family matter. Iron Peak tradition. I'm sure you understand. I didn't ask for your respect, Beta. Kael's eyes didn't leave Elric. And I certainly didn't ask for a lecture on tradition. I came here because I was invited to witness a mating ceremony. I chose a seat. If that's a problem, feel free to withdraw your invitation. The air turned to ice. No one withdrew an invitation from the Lycan King, not if they wanted to keep their territory intact, not if they wanted to survive the next full moon. Elric's expression went very, very still. He was trapped, and he knew it. Challenge Kael, and risk open conflict with the most powerful wolf in the north. Back down and look weak in front of his entire pack on the night he was supposed to be cementing his authority. Lyra watched the calculation flicker across his face. She had seen it before. The cold math her brother did when he was deciding whether something, or someone, was worth the cost. Seraphine rose from her seat, her crimson dress flowing like blood as she descended the dais and moved to Elric's side. Her smile was sharp, calculated, designed to diffuse tension with charm and misdirection. Perhaps, she said smoothly, her voice honey over venom, the king simply wanted a quieter view. After all, Lyra has always preferred solitude. Haven't you, dear? It was an insult wrapped in kindness, and everyone in the room knew it. Lyra's face burned. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor, to become the invisible thing they had always told her she was. But Kael's response was immediate. I've found, he said, his tone still conversational, as if they were discussing the weather, that the quietest wolves often see the most. They notice things, patterns, weaknesses. They understand who's actually in control and who's only pretending. Seraphine's smile froze. Her eyes flickered with something cold and dangerous. Elric's hand clenched into a fist at his side, and Lyra, silent, invisible Lyra, felt something crack open inside her chest. For the first time in her life, someone had spoken for her. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because he chose to. Because in some twisted, incomprehensible way, it served his purpose. And she didn't care why. She was just grateful it had happened at all. Elric took a slow breath, visibly reining himself in. When he spoke again, his voice was smooth, controlled, every syllable a weapon sheathed in diplomacy. "Very well," he said. "Enjoy the ceremony, King Draven. I'm sure it will be, memorable." He turned and walked back to the dais, his spine straight, his movements precise. Seraphine followed, her hips swaying, her smile back in place. But the damage was done. Every eye in the room was now on Lyra. And beside her, calm as death itself, sat the most dangerous man in the north. The ceremony continued, but the energy had shifted. What should have been Elric's moment of triumph had become a spectacle of confusion and whispered speculation. Why was Kael Draven sitting with the wolfless girl? What did it mean? Was it an insult to the Alpha? A political move? A message? Lyra kept her head down, her hands still clutched around the stone, her mind racing. She didn't understand any of this. Kael hadn't spoken to her again. He simply sat beside her, a wall of silent, unyielding presence that made it impossible for anyone to approach her the way they usually did, with mockery, with dismissal, with cruelty disguised as concern. At one point, a younger wolf, a warrior named Garrett, drunk and emboldened by too much mead, staggered over and leaned against the table, his grin wide and stupid. "Well, well," he slurred, his eyes sliding over Lyra with open contempt. "Guess even the wolfless can catch a king's eye if the lights are low enough, huh?" A few of his friends laughed. Lyra's face burned with shame. Kael didn't move. He didn't even look at Garrett. He simply turned his head slowly until his silver eyes locked onto the younger wolf. And the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Garrett's laughter died in his throat. His grin faltered, and then, fast, stumbling, nearly tripping over his own feet, he backed away and disappeared into the crowd. Lyra exhaled shakily. "You didn't have to." "I didn't do it for you," Kael said, his tone flat. "I did it because he was annoying." Despite everything, despite the fear, the confusion, the crushing weight of every stare in the room, Lyra almost smiled. It was a small thing, a crack in the armor she'd built around herself. But it was there. Hours passed. The music grew louder, wilder, driven by drums and flutes that echoed off the stone walls. The wine flowed freely, inhibitions dissolved, and the ceremony shifted from formal ritual to something more primal. Couples began to slip away into the shadows, their laughter low and knowing. The pack was celebrating, but Lyra wasn't part of it. She never had been. Elric, now seated once again beside Seraphine, watched Lyra from across the hall. His expression was unreadable, but she knew him well enough to recognize the calculation behind it. He was planning something. She could feel it. Finally, as the night deepened and the crowd thinned to only the most dedicated revelers, Elric stood. He raised his goblet high, and the room quieted almost instantly. "Before the night ends," he called out, his voice cutting through the music and laughter, "I want to honor something important. Family, blood, legacy." The hall fell silent. Lyra's stomach dropped. No, not now. Not tonight. Elric's eyes locked on hers, and his smile was warm, almost affectionate. It was the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Lyra," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "My sister, my blood. Come here." Every head turned, 100 pairs of eyes locked onto her, waiting, judging. Lyra didn't move. She couldn't. Her body had turned to stone. "Lyra," Elric repeated, his smile sharpening just slightly. "Don't be shy. Come stand with your family. Let the pack see you." It was a command wrapped in kindness, a trap disguised as an honor. And she knew exactly what he was doing. He was going to parade her in front of everyone, remind them of what she was, what she wasn't. He was going to use her to reinforce his own strength by showing how gracious he was to tolerate her existence. Beside her, Kael's expression didn't change, but his voice, low, steady, anchored, reached her like a lifeline. "You don't have to go." Lyra's breath hitched. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide, searching. "What?" "You heard me. Kael's silver gaze held hers. You don't have to do what he says. He's my brother. He's the alpha. And you're not Pac. Kael's words were blunt, brutal, so his authority doesn't apply to you. Not unless you give it to him. Lyra's heart hammered. She looked at Elric, at the crowd, at the life she'd always known. Small, painful, suffocating, but predictable. Safe. And then she looked at Kael, at the man who had sat beside her when no one else would, who had defended her without asking for anything in return, who was offering her something she'd never had before, a choice. Her fingers loosened around the stone, and she made a decision. She stayed. The silence that followed was deafening. Elric's smile vanished. His eyes went cold, hard, the mask of warmth cracking to reveal the fury beneath. Lyra, he said again, and this time there was no kindness in his voice, only command. I said, come here. Lyra's hands trembled, but she didn't move. She looked at her brother, the man who had ignored her, controlled her, erased her for her entire life, and she said the word she had never been allowed to say. No. It was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the hall, it rang like a bell. Elric's expression went blank with shock, and then, slowly, it twisted into something dark, something dangerous. What did you just say to me? Lyra's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. I said no. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, disbelief. A wolfless girl had just defied an alpha, her own brother, in front of the entire pack. It was unthinkable, unforgivable. Elric descended the dais, his movements slow, deliberate, predatory. Marcus followed, his hand on his blade. Seraphine watched from above, her expression unreadable. And Kael simply leaned back in his chair and watched. Like he was waiting to see what would happen next. Like this was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Elric stopped 3 feet from Lyra's table. His voice was low, controlled, vibrating with barely leashed rage. You will stand. You will come to the dais, and you will show the respect that is owed to your alpha, or I will have you removed. Lyra's entire body shook, but something inside her, something that had been buried for so long she'd forgotten it existed, refused to bend. I'm not part of this pack, she said, her voice stronger now. You've made that very clear my entire life, so I don't owe you anything. Elric's eyes flashed gold. His wolf was rising. And that's when Kael stood. The movement was slow, casual, almost lazy, but the effect was immediate. Every wolf in the room tensed. Kael didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Alpha Vane, he said, his tone polite, almost friendly. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Elric turned to face him, his jaw tight. This doesn't concern you. Actually, Kael said, it does. You see, I came here tonight expecting to witness a display of strength, leadership, the kind of authority that makes a pack thrive. He paused. Instead, I'm watching you bully a girl who has no wolf, no power, no voice. And I'm wondering, is that really what strength looks like in Iron Peak? The words landed like stones, Elric's face flushed with rage. You have no right. I have every right. Kael's voice went cold. I'm the Lycan King, and under Northern law, any wolf, or wolfless, can claim sanctuary if they believe they're being treated unjustly. Lyra just did that, whether she knows it or not. Lyra's eyes widened. Sanctuary? Elric's expression twisted. She didn't say. She defied you, publicly. That's a claim. Kael's smile was razor sharp. And I'm accepting it. The hall exploded into chaos. Wolves shouted, argued, demanded answers. Elric looked like he wanted to tear Kael apart with his bare hands. But he couldn't, because Kael was right, and everyone knew it. Marcus stepped forward, his voice tight. This is a violation of pack sovereignty. This is Northern law, Kael said, which supersedes pack law. Read your history, Beta. Seraphine descended the dais, her voice smooth, diplomatic. Surely we can resolve this peacefully. Lyra is family. We only want what's best for her. Kael's eyes flicked to her. Then let her choose. He turned to Lyra, and for the first time since he'd sat down, his expression softened, just slightly. You can stay here, he said quietly, under their rules, their control, or you can leave, with me, and find out what happens when you stop apologizing for existing. Lyra's breath caught. It wasn't a rescue, it was an offer, a door she'd never known existed, and standing in front of it was the most dangerous man in the world, asking her to walk through. She looked at Elric, at the brother who had never loved her, at the pack that had never wanted her, at the life that had never been hers. And then she looked at the stone in her hand, the last piece of her mother, the only thing that had made her feel like she belonged anywhere. And slowly, deliberately, she set it down on the table. She stood, turned to Kael, and said the word that changed everything. Yes, the word hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Yes, Lyra had said it. She had chosen, and now there was no taking it back. The hall erupted into chaos. Wolves surged to their feet, shouting, arguing, their voices crashing over each other like waves against rock. Some demanded Kael be thrown out. Others called for Lyra to be restrained. A few, very few, stood in stunned silence, watching history crack open in front of them. Elric didn't move. He stood 3 feet from Lyra, his face a mask of controlled fury, his eyes burning gold as his wolf clawed just beneath the surface. His hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Lyra's legs felt like water, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet his eyes. "I know exactly what I'm doing." It was a lie. She had no idea, but she said it anyway. Elric's jaw tightened. "You think he's saving you? You think this is some kind of rescue?" He gestured toward Kael with barely concealed contempt. "He's using you. Whatever game he's playing, you're just a piece on the board." "Maybe," Lyra said quietly, "but at least he's giving me a choice." The words hit Elric like a slap. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not anger, not rage, hurt. But it was gone so fast Lyra thought she might have imagined it. Elric turned to Kael, his voice sharp as broken glass. "This is a violation of pack sovereignty. You can't just walk into another alpha's territory and claim one of his wolves." "She's not one of your wolves," Kael said calmly. "You made that very clear, repeatedly, in front of everyone." He gestured to the crowd. "Ask them, is Lyra Vane considered pack?" Silence. No one answered. Because everyone knew the truth. Lyra had never been pack. She had been tolerated, hidden, erased. And now that truth was a weapon being used against the alpha who had wielded it for so long. Seraphine stepped forward, her crimson dress flowing like blood, her voice smooth and diplomatic. "Kael, surely we can come to an arrangement. Lyra is young, confused. She doesn't understand the implications of what she's agreeing to." Kael's eyes slid to Seraphine, cold and unimpressed. "She understood well enough to say yes." "But are you saying she's too stupid to make her own decisions?" Kael's tone was polite, almost curious, because that's what it sounds like. Seraphine's smile tightened. "I'm saying she's been isolated her entire life. She doesn't know the world outside Iron Peak. She doesn't know you." "She knows you," Kael said, "and she's still choosing to leave. What does that tell you?" The insult landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the crowd. Seraphine's expression went ice cold. Marcus stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "Enough. You're twisting words and making a mockery of our traditions. If you want to challenge the alpha, do it properly, but don't hide behind some legal loophole and a girl with no wolf." Kael turned to face Marcus fully, and the shift in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't leaning back anymore. He wasn't casual. He was ready. "Are you challenging me, Beta?" Marcus hesitated, because challenging Kael Draven wasn't just dangerous. It was suicide. "I'm defending my alpha's honor," Marcus said carefully. "Your alpha's honor," Kael said, "is built on the suffering of someone weaker than him. If that's what you're defending, then you've already lost." The words cut through the noise like a blade. And for the first time, a few wolves in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few looked at Lyra with something that wasn't contempt. Guilt, maybe. Or shame. Elric's voice cut through the tension like thunder. "You want her? Fine, take her. But don't pretend this is about justice or honor. You're doing this to embarrass me. To show the other packs that you can walk into Iron Peak and take whatever you want. Kael's expression didn't change. If that's what you think, then you've missed the point entirely. Then what is the point? Elric demanded. Kael was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at Lyra, his silver eyes unreadable. The point, he said quietly, is that she deserves better than this. The simplicity of it, the truth of it, hit Lyra like a physical blow. She had spent her entire life being told she was worthless, broken, a mistake, and now a king, a stranger, was saying she deserved better. It didn't make sense, but it felt like oxygen after drowning. Elric let out a harsh laugh. You don't even know her. I know enough, Kael said. I know she survived 20 years in a place that wanted her gone. I know she's still standing when most would have broken. That's more than enough. Lyra's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, to thank him, to ask him why he was doing this, but the words wouldn't come. Elric took a step forward, his wolf rising, his voice dropping to a growl. If you walk out of here with her, there will be consequences. Political consequences. The Southern Pacts won't stand for this. Neither will the Council. Kael smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Let them try. The threat was clear. The Lycan King was not afraid of councils or pacts or political maneuvering. He was a force unto himself, and anyone who stood in his way would be crushed. Elric knew it. Everyone knew it. But admitting it would destroy what little authority he had left. So instead, he did the only thing he could. He turned to Lyra, and he played his last card. If you leave, Elric said, his voice soft, almost gentle, you can never come back. You'll be exiled, cut off. You'll have no family, no home, no history. Is that really what you want? Lyra's breath caught, because he was right. If she walked out those doors, she would be alone in a way she had never been before. At least here, she had a roof over her head, food, a bed, the ghost of a family that had once existed. Out there, she would have nothing, except Kael. And she didn't even know if she could trust him. She looked at the stone she'd left on the table, her mother's stone. The only thing that had kept her tethered to the idea that she had once been loved. And she realized something. She didn't need it anymore. Because love that required her to disappear wasn't love at all. She turned back to Elric and her voice was steady. I've never had a home here. I've never had a family. You made sure of that. She paused. So I'm not losing anything. Elric's face went blank, and then, slowly, it hardened into something cold and final. So be it. He turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out across the hall. By the authority of the Iron Peak Alpha, I hereby exile Lyra Vane. She is no longer bloodkin, no longer welcome. If she sets foot on Packlands again, she will be treated as a rogue, hunted, killed. The words landed like blows. Lyra felt them settle into her bones, heavy and irreversible. She was free, and she was utterly alone. Kael stepped beside her, his presence solid and grounding. Can you walk? He asked quietly. Lyra nodded, even though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Then let's go. He didn't touch her, didn't guide her. He simply turned and walked toward the doors, his 2 sentinels falling into step behind him. And Lyra followed. Every step felt like walking through fire. She could feel the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her, judging, condemning, memorizing her face so they could tell the story later, the story of the wolfless girl who defied an alpha and left with a king. As they reached the doors, a voice called out from the crowd. Wait! Lyra turned. A young woman stepped forward. Her name was Mira, a low-ranking she-wolf who had once been kind to Lyra when they were children, before the pack had taught her that kindness to the wolfless was a weakness. Mira's eyes were wide, uncertain. Are you sure? She asked softly. Lyra wanted to say yes, wanted to sound confident, strong, but all she could manage was a small nod. Mira looked like she wanted to say more, but then her mate grabbed her arm and pulled her back, whispering harshly in her ear. And just like that, the moment was gone. Lyra turned back to the doors, and she walked out of Iron Peak for the last time. The night air hit her like a slap. It was cold, bitterly cold, and the wind cut through her thin dress like knives. She hadn't thought to bring a cloak, hadn't thought about anything beyond the need to escape. Kael's sentinels moved ahead, their armor gleaming in the moonlight. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his neck, gestured toward a line of horses waiting in the courtyard. Lyra had never ridden a horse before. She stared at the massive creatures, her heart sinking. Kyle noticed. Of course he did. "You'll ride with me," he said. It wasn't a question. He mounted in one smooth motion, his movements fluid and controlled, and then extended a hand down to her. Lyra hesitated. This was real now. She had left. She had burned every bridge, and now she was about to ride off into the night with a man she didn't know, to a place she had never been, with no idea what came next. But what choice did she have? She took his hand. His grip was strong, steady, and he pulled her up behind him with ease. She settled awkwardly onto the horse, her arms wrapping around his waist to keep from falling. He was warm, solid, real. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Lyra felt something other than fear. She felt hope. Kale spurred the horse forward, and they rode out of the courtyard, through the gates, and into the forest beyond. Behind them, the lights of Iron Peak faded into the distance, and Lyra didn't look back. They rode in silence for what felt like hours. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, their branches twisting together to block out the stars. The only sound was the rhythmic thunder of hooves against earth and the occasional snap of a branch. Lyra's body ached from the unfamiliar position, her legs cramping, her arms trembling from holding on so tightly. But she didn't complain. She had no right to complain. She had chosen this. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Kyle slowed the horse and guided them into a small clearing beside a river. "We'll stop here," he said. His sentinels dismounted and immediately set to work, one building a fire, the other checking the perimeter. Kale swung down from the horse and then turned to help Lyra. She slid down clumsily, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. Kale caught her arm, steadying her. "You did well," he said. Lyra almost laughed. "I didn't do anything. I just held on." "You made a choice," Kyle said. "That's more than most people ever do." He released her arm and moved toward the fire, leaving Lyra standing alone in the cold. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, and looked around the clearing. It was small, isolated, safe. But it wasn't home, and she had no idea where home was anymore. One of the sentinels, the one with the scar, approached and handed her a cloak. It was thick, lined with fur, and far too large for her. "Put it on," he said gruffly. "You'll freeze otherwise." Lyra took it, grateful, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, and she almost cried from the relief of it. Kale was crouched by the fire, feeding it small sticks, his expression unreadable. Lyra sat down across from him, the flames casting dancing shadows across his face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lyra broke the silence. "Why did you do that?" Kale didn't look up. "Do what?" "Sit beside me. Defend me. Offer me sanctuary." She paused. "Why?" Kale was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the fire. Then he said, "Because I know what it's like to be powerless in a room full of people who think they own you." Lyra's breath caught. She hadn't expected honesty. "You're the Lycan King," she said. "You're the most powerful wolf in the north. How could you ever be powerless?" Kale's smile was bitter. "Power doesn't mean you're free. Sometimes it just means you're trapped in a bigger cage." Lyra didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, the weight of everything that had happened settling over them like a blanket. Finally, Lyra asked the question that had been gnawing at her since the moment they left. "What happens now?" Kale looked up at her, his silver eyes sharp and assessing. "Now," he said, "you survive, you learn, and you figure out who you are when no one's telling you what you're supposed to be." "And if I can't? Then you'll fail," Kyle said bluntly. "But at least you'll fail on your own terms." It wasn't comforting, but it was honest, and Lyra realized that was all she'd ever wanted. Honesty. The truth. Even when it hurt. Kale stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Get some rest. We leave at first light." "Where are we going?" "North," Kyle said. "To my territory. To Ravencrest." Lyra's heart skipped. Ravencrest. The seat of the Lycan King's power. A place she had only heard about in stories. A place where wolves were stronger, fiercer, more dangerous than anywhere else. And she, a wolfless girl with no training, no strength, no place in this world, was being brought into the heart of it. "I don't belong there," Lyra whispered. Kael looked at her, and for the first time his expression softened. "You didn't belong in Iron Peak either," he said, "but you survived. You'll survive this too." He turned and walked toward the edge of the clearing, leaving Lyra alone by the fire. She pulled the cloak tighter around herself and stared into the flames. She had no idea what came next. But for the first time in her life, the unknown didn't terrify her. It felt like possibility. They reached Ravencrest 3 days later. The journey had been brutal. Long hours in the saddle, sleeping on hard ground, eating whatever the sentinels could hunt. Lyra's entire body ached, her muscles screaming in protest with every movement. But she didn't complain. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences. Ravencrest was nothing like Iron Peak. Where Iron Peak had been stone and smoke, Ravencrest was wood and shadow. The stronghold was built into the side of a mountain, its walls made of dark timber and ancient stone, its towers rising like claws against the sky. It was beautiful and terrifying. As they rode through the gates, Lyra felt the weight of 100 stairs. Wolves lined the courtyard, watching in silence as Kael dismounted and handed the reins to a waiting stable hand. They looked at Lyra with open curiosity and suspicion. Kael gestured for her to follow, and she did, her legs trembling, her heart pounding. They entered the main hall, a massive space with high ceilings, tapestries depicting battles and hunts, and a long table that could seat 50 wolves easily. At the head of the table sat a woman. She was older, maybe 50, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes the color of storm clouds. She wore black leather and a cloak lined with white fur, and when she looked at Lyra, her expression was unreadable. "Kael," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "You've returned." "I have," Kael said. The woman's eyes flicked to Lyra. "And you've brought a guest." "I've brought someone under my protection," Kael corrected. The woman's eyebrow arched. "Protection? How interesting." She rose from her seat and walked toward them, her movements graceful and predatory. She stopped in front of Lyra and studied her with the kind of intensity that made Lyra want to disappear. "What's your name, child?" "Lyra," she whispered. "Lyra," the woman repeated, testing the name. "And why does the Lycan King feel the need to protect you?" Lyra didn't know how to answer that, but Kael did. "Because she had the courage to stand up to an alpha when no one else would," he said. "And because she deserves a chance to find out what she's capable of." The woman's eyes narrowed. "She has no wolf." "No," Kael agreed, "she doesn't." "Then what use is she?" The question was blunt, cruel, but it was also the question everyone in the room was thinking. Kael's voice was calm. "That remains to be seen." The woman held his gaze for a long moment. Then she smiled. "Very well," she said. "Let's see what she's made of." She turned to Lyra, and her smile sharpened. "Welcome to Ravencrest, Lyra Vane. I am Alara Winterscar, High Counselor of the North. And if you're going to survive here, you're going to have to prove you're worth the trouble." Lyra's throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod. "I will." Alara's smile didn't waver. "We'll see." And in that moment, Lyra realized that leaving Iron Peak had only been the beginning. The real test was just starting. The first week in Ravencrest nearly killed her. Not from violence, not from cruelty, but from the sheer exhausting weight of proving she had a right to exist. Alara Winterscar had made good on her promise. Every morning before dawn, Lyra was dragged from her small room in the servants' quarters and forced into training that would have broken most wolves. Running until her lungs burned and her legs turned to jelly, lifting stones until her arms shook and her shoulders screamed, sparring with opponents who had no interest in going easy on someone without a wolf. She failed, constantly, spectacularly, and every failure was watched. The wolves of Ravencrest gathered at the edges of the training grounds like vultures circling a dying animal, their eyes sharp and judgmental. They whispered behind their hands, laughed when she stumbled, placed bets on how long the wolfless girl would last before she gave up and begged to be sent back to whatever hole she'd crawled out of. Lyra heard every word. She felt every stare burning into her skin like brands. And she kept going, because what else could she do? Kael had given her a choice, and she had taken it. There was no going back now. Iron Peak had exiled her. Her brother had erased her from the family line as if she'd never existed. This brutal, unforgiving place was all she had left. On the 8th morning, Lyra woke to find Alara standing in her doorway. The High Counselor's expression was unreadable, her storm-gray eyes assessing Lyra like she was a problem that needed solving or a threat that needed eliminating. "Get dressed," Alara said, her voice clipped and commanding. "You're coming with me." Lyra's heart sank. "Where?" "You'll see." Lyra had learned not to ask questions. Questions implied you had a right to answers, and she had no rights here. She was a guest, a burden, a project that might not be worth completing. She dressed quickly in the plain tunic and trousers she'd been given, rough fabric that chafed against her still healing bruises, and followed Alara through the winding corridors of Raven Crest. The stronghold was a labyrinth. Stone passages twisted and turned, some climbing higher into the mountain, others descending into depths that smelled of earth and age. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that made the walls seem alive. 20 minutes later, Lyra found herself standing in a chamber deep beneath Ravencrest's main hall. The walls were carved from black stone, smooth and polished, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and something older, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up and her instincts scream at her to run. Alara moved to the center of the room, where a circle had been etched into the floor. Symbols. Lyra didn't recognize spiraled outward from the center, intricate and ancient, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. "Do you know what this is?" Alara asked, her voice echoing in the enclosed space. Lyra shook her head, her mouth too dry to speak. "This is a testing ground," Alara said, running her fingers along the edge of the circle. "A place where we measure potential, strength, spirit, truth." Lyra's throat tightened. "What kind of truth?" Alara's smile was cold, almost predatory. "The kind you can't lie about. The kind that lives in your blood and bones whether you acknowledge it or not." She gestured to the circle with an elegant, commanding motion. "Step inside." Lyra didn't move. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to refuse, to get as far away from this place as possible. But where would she go? Out into the northern wilderness where rogues and worse things hunted? Back to Iron Peak, where her brother had promised to kill her if she ever returned? "I don't understand what you want from me," Lyra said quietly, hating how small her voice sounded. "I want to see if Kael's instincts are worth trusting," Alara said bluntly. "He believes you're more than what you appear to be. He's staked his reputation on bringing you here, on protecting you. I'm not convinced, so we're going to find out." "How?" Alara's eyes glittered in the dim light. "By seeing if you break." Her hand moved in a sharp, precise gesture, and the symbols on the floor flared to brilliant life. The air in the room shifted immediately, thickened, became heavy and oppressive. Lyra felt pressure building around her, pressing down on her chest, her lungs, her bones. It was like being buried alive, crushed under the weight of something invisible and immense. She gasped, struggling to draw breath. "Step into the circle, Lyra," Alara said, her voice cutting through the growing pressure like a blade. "Or leave Ravencrest. Those are your only options." Lyra's hands trembled violently. Her vision swam. She thought about running, about refusing, about telling Alara that this was insane, that she didn't sign up to be tortured in some ancient ritual chamber by a woman who clearly had no regard for her life. But then she thought about Iron Peak, about her brother's cold dismissal, about the pack members who had looked at her like she was nothing, less than nothing, a stain on their bloodline, about spending her entire life being invisible, powerless, erased. And she stepped forward. The moment her foot crossed the edge of the circle, the world exploded into agony, pain. White-hot, searing, unbearable pain shot through her body like lightning striking flesh. It felt like every nerve was on fire, like her skin was being peeled away strip by strip, like her bones were cracking and splintering under the weight of something enormous and invisible pressing down on her from all directions. She screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and animal, echoing off the stone walls. She fell to her knees, her hands clawing at the floor, her fingernails scraping against stone as if she could dig her way out of her own body. "Get up!" Alara's voice cut through the agony, cold and unforgiving. Lyra couldn't. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. couldn't do anything except endure the waves of pain crashing over her again and again. Get up! Lyra's vision blurred. Tears streamed down her face. She could feel something inside her, something deep and buried and forgotten, twisting, clawing, trying desperately to break free from whatever cage had held it her entire life. It wasn't a wolf. She knew that instinctively. It was something else, something older, something that felt both terrifying and somehow familiar, like a song she'd heard in a dream. "What is this?" Lyra gasped, the words barely intelligible through her ragged breathing. "Your truth," Alara said, watching with clinical detachment. "Stop fighting it." But Lyra didn't know how to stop fighting. Fighting was all she'd ever done. Fighting to survive in a pack that hated her. Fighting to find scraps of dignity in a life designed to strip her of it. Fighting to believe she deserved to exist. The pain intensified, reaching a crescendo that made her previous suffering seem like a gentle warmth. Lyra felt herself slipping, felt the edges of her consciousness fraying and unraveling like old rope. And then, a voice. Not Alara's, not her own. A voice that came from somewhere deep inside her, ancient and powerful and utterly unfamiliar. It resonated in her chest, in her bones, in places she didn't have names for. Let go. Lyra's breath hitched. Let go, or you will die here. Alone. Afraid. Just as they always said you would. She didn't know if she believed it. Didn't know if this was real or some hallucination brought on by pain and terror. But she was out of options. So she stopped fighting. She stopped resisting the thing clawing its way to the surface. Stopped trying to control it or contain it or make it something manageable. And the moment she surrendered, everything changed. The pain vanished. Not gradually, not slowly. It simply ceased to exist, as if it had never been there at all. The pressure lifted from her chest, and she could breathe again, deep, full breaths that tasted of stone and earth and power. And in place of the agony, something else surged through her veins, something warm and alive and immense. It spread through her body like molten gold, filling every empty space inside her, every wound, every scar, every hollow place where love and belonging should have lived. Lyra's eyes snapped open. The symbols on the floor were no longer glowing faintly. They were blazing, brilliant, and blinding, casting light so bright it turned the black stone chamber into something that looked almost celestial. The shadows on the walls danced and twisted like living creatures, responding to some rhythm Lyra could feel but not hear. And at the center of it all stood Lyra. Her body was still her own. She hadn't shifted, hadn't transformed into a wolf or any other creature, but she felt different, stronger, complete. For the first time in her life, she felt whole. Alara's expression shifted from cold clinical assessment to something else entirely. Something that looked almost like awe mixed with a healthy dose of fear. "What are you?" she whispered. Lyra didn't answer, because she didn't know. The glow faded slowly, the symbols dimming gradually until the room returned to its original darkness. But the change in Lyra remained. She could feel it humming beneath her skin, a constant presence that was both foreign and somehow intrinsically hers. She stood in the center of the circle on shaking legs, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and something else, something that felt like awakening after a lifetime of sleep. Alara approached slowly, cautiously, her eyes never leaving Lyra's face. She moved like someone approaching a wild animal, uncertain whether it would run or attack. "You're not wolfless," she said quietly, each word deliberate and heavy with meaning. "You never were." Lyra's voice was hoarse, raw from screaming. "Then what am I?" Alara was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Lyra want to look away. Then she said, "Something we thought was extinct. Something that hasn't walked these lands in over 300 years. Before Lyra could ask what that meant, before she could process any of this impossible information, the door to the chamber burst open with a crash that echoed like thunder. Kael strode in, his expression thunderous, his eyes flashing silver with barely contained fury. His power filled the room immediately, pressing against the walls like a physical presence. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous as his eyes locked on Alara. "Testing her," Alara said calmly, as if she hadn't just put Lyra through what felt like death and resurrection. "As you asked me to. I asked you to train her, not torture her, not risk killing her in some ancient ritual that hasn't been performed in centuries. They're the same thing when you're dealing with power like this, Alara said, gesturing toward Lyra. And it worked. Look at her. Kael's gaze shifted to Lyra, and his anger faltered. She must have looked different, must have felt different to his heightened senses, because the way he was looking at her now was nothing like the way he'd looked at her before. There was recognition in his eyes, understanding, and something that looked disturbingly like concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentling slightly. Lyra wanted to say yes, wanted to reassure him that she was fine, that everything was under control, that she could handle whatever came next. But the truth was, she had no idea if she was all right. She felt like she'd been taken apart and put back together wrong, or maybe right for the first time. "I don't know," she admitted. Kael turned back to Alara, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "What did you do to her?" "I woke her up," Alara said simply. "I activated the bloodline that's been dormant in her family for generations, and now we know exactly what she is." "Which is?" Alara's smile was grim, almost pitying. "A spirit born." The word hung in the air like a curse, heavy with implications Lyra didn't understand. Kael's entire body went rigid. His expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Lyra to track. Shock, disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked like resignation. "That's impossible," he said flatly. "They're gone. The bloodlines were hunted to extinction. The last confirmed spirit-born died 300 years ago." "Apparently not," Alara said, her tone almost smug. She gestured toward Lyra like she was presenting evidence in a trial. The bloodline survived, hidden, diluted through generations of mixing with normal wolf packs, buried so deep that even the carriers didn't know what they were. But it's there, and now it's awake. Lyra's head spun. The room tilted around her, and she had to lock her knees to keep from falling. "What's a spirit-born?" Alara and Kael exchanged a long look, some wordless communication passing between them that Lyra couldn't decipher. Finally, Kael spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Spirit-born are wolves who don't shift into animal form," he explained. "Instead, they channel something else, something spiritual, elemental, connected to the earth and the old powers that existed before packs, before territories, before any of the structures we have now." "They were powerful," Alara continued. "Too powerful. They could manipulate energy, sense things other wolves couldn't, influence the natural world in ways that seemed like magic. Most packs hunted them down centuries ago because they couldn't be controlled, because they threatened the established order." Lyra felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. "You're saying I'm dangerous." "I'm saying you're rare," Kael corrected, moving closer to her. "And yes, potentially dangerous. If you don't learn to control it, if you let fear or anger guide the power instead of intention." "And if I can't?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't control it?" "Then you'll destroy yourself," Alara said bluntly, her storm-gray eyes boring into Lyra's. "The power will consume you from the inside out, burning through your body until there's nothing left. Or someone else will destroy you first, because a spirit-born who can't control their abilities is a threat to everyone around them." Lyra's legs finally gave out. She sank to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably, her mind reeling with information she couldn't process. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mistake, some terrible joke the universe was playing on her. She wasn't special. She wasn't powerful. She was just a girl who had been broken and dismissed her entire life. A mistake, an embarrassment. The wolfless daughter who should have been abandoned at birth. Kael crouched in front of her, bringing himself to eye level. His voice was soft but firm. "Lyra, look at me." She forced herself to meet his silver eyes, searching for answers she knew he didn't have. "You survived Iron Peak," he said. "You survived being treated as less than nothing for 20 years. You survived the journey here, survived Alara's training, survived this test that would have killed most people. You're stronger than you think, stronger than you know." "I don't feel strong," Lyra whispered, her voice breaking. "I feel terrified." "Good," Kael said. "Fear means you're paying attention. Fear means you understand the stakes. Use it. Channel it. Don't let it control you." Lyra wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the strength he seemed so certain she possessed, but all she could think about was how much easier it would have been to stay invisible, to stay broken, to remain the powerless girl no one expected anything from. At least then, she couldn't fail, couldn't disappoint, couldn't become the monster everyone feared. The news spread through Ravencrest like wildfire racing through drought-dried brush. Within hours, every wolf in the stronghold knew that the wolfless girl wasn't wolfless at all. She was spirit-born, a creature from ancient legend, a bloodline that had been systematically wiped out centuries ago because they were too dangerous to let live, and she had no idea how to control it. The reactions were immediate and sharply divided. Some wolves looked at her with something approaching awe, their eyes wide with wonder and fear mixed together. Others stared with open hostility, their lips curled in disgust or anger, clearly believing she had no business being here. A few avoided looking at her entirely, as if eye contact might somehow trigger whatever destructive power slept inside her. Lyra kept her head down and tried desperately to disappear again, to become invisible the way she'd learned to be in Iron Peak. But it was impossible now. She was marked, noticed, watched constantly. And the worst part was, she could feel it. The power Alara had awakened inside her hadn't gone away. It wasn't something she could turn off or ignore. It hummed beneath her skin like a second heartbeat, restless and alive, constantly moving, constantly present. Sometimes it flared without warning, a sudden spike of heat that made sweat break out across her skin, a flash of light that emanated from her hands, a pressure that built in the air around her and made it shimmer like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. She had no control over it, and everyone knew it. On the third day after the test, Lyra was summoned to the Great Hall. The massive room was packed wall to wall with bodies. Every high-ranking wolf in Ravencrest had gathered, along with what seemed like half the general population. Their expressions ranged from curious to openly hostile. The air was thick with tension and the heavy musk of too many predators in one enclosed space. At the head of the long table sat Kael, his face carefully blank, revealing nothing. Beside him sat Alara, her storm-gray eyes fixed on Lyra with that same unreadable intensity. Lyra stood in the center of the room, feeling like she was on trial. Like she was being judged for crimes she hadn't committed yet, but that everyone was certain she would. A tall man with scars covering his arms like a map of old battles stepped forward from the crowd. His name was Gareth, and he was one of Kael's senior captains. His voice was hard, uncompromising, carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "With respect, my king," Gareth said, his eyes flicking briefly to Kael before settling back on Lyra with undisguised suspicion. "I don't understand why we're harboring someone who can't even control her own power. She's a liability, a danger to everyone in this stronghold. What happens when she loses control? When that power erupts in the middle of the training yard or the Great Hall, people could die." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd like a wave gathering strength. Kael's expression didn't change, but his voice carried clearly through the noise. "She's under my protection." "Protection doesn't mean wisdom," Gareth shot back, his courage bolstered by the supportive murmurs around him. "What happens when she loses control during a battle? Or in the middle of the stronghold when children are present? Innocent people could die because you decided to gamble on someone with no training, no experience, and no ability to manage what she is. People could also die if we throw away someone with her potential," Kael said coldly. "Or have you forgotten what Spirit-born were capable of when they fought alongside us instead of against us?" "I haven't forgotten anything," Gareth said. "That's exactly why I'm concerned. They were hunted for a reason, my king. They were too powerful, too unpredictable. They couldn't be trusted to stay loyal to any pack because their power made them believe they were above pack law." "They were hunted because people were afraid of them," Alara interjected smoothly, "because they represented a challenge to traditional power structures, not because they were inherently evil or dangerous." "Fear and caution are not the same thing," Gareth countered. "I'm asking for caution, for common sense. We have families here, children, people who can't defend themselves against that kind of power if it goes wrong." Kael leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm that made the hairs on Lyra's neck stand up. "And I'm telling you to trust my judgment. Lyra stays, she trains, she learns to control what she is. End of discussion." Gareth's jaw tightened, muscles bunching beneath scarred skin, but he didn't argue further. He simply looked at Lyra with an expression that said more clearly than words, "You'd better be worth it. You'd better be worth the risk he's taking on you." Lyra wanted to shrink, to apologize, to promise she wouldn't be a burden, wouldn't be dangerous, wouldn't fail. But she stayed silent because she was tired of apologizing for existing, tired of making herself smaller to make others comfortable. The meeting ended with a tension that felt like a storm about to break. The wolves dispersed slowly, reluctantly, their whispers following Lyra like shadows she couldn't escape. As she turned to leave, desperate to get back to her tiny room where she could at least pretend to have privacy, a voice stopped her. "Wait." Lyra turned. A young woman stood a few feet away, watching her with sharp, assessing eyes. She was tall and lean, built like a weapon, with dark hair pulled back in a severe braid and eyes the color of amber catching firelight. Everything about her suggested deadly competence, from the way she stood balanced on the balls of her feet to the multiple weapons visible on her belt. "I'm Dessa," the woman said, "Kael's head tracker. And apparently, starting tomorrow, I'm going to be training you." Lyra blinked, caught off guard. "Training me?" "Someone has to," Dessa said dryly, a hint of dark humor in her voice. "And Alara's methods are a little too brutal for extended use. You'd either die or go insane. So lucky you. You get me instead." Lyra didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. "I don't know if I can do this." Dessa's smile was sharp as broken glass. "You don't have a choice, so you might as well get good at it. Tomorrow, dawn, training yard. Don't be late." And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving Lyra standing alone in the emptying hall. Training with Dessa was different from anything Lyra had experienced before. Where Alara had been cold and clinical, focused on breaking Lyra down to see what remained, Dessa was blunt and intensely practical. She didn't care about Lyra's past, didn't care that she'd been invisible her whole life or that she came from a pack that had treated her like garbage. She only cared about results. "Your power responds to emotion," Dessa explained on the first day, circling Lyra like a predator studying prey. "Fear, anger, pain, desperation. That's why it flared during Alara's test. You were terrified, pushed to your absolute limit, and the power responded to that intensity. But terror isn't control. Rage isn't precision. You need to learn to channel it, direct it, make it answer to your will instead of your panic." "How?" Lyra asked, feeling helpless and overwhelmed. "By figuring out what you're fighting for," Dessa said, stopping in front of her. "Right now you're just surviving, reacting, trying not to drown. That's not enough. You need a purpose, something that matters more than fear, something worth fighting for." Lyra didn't have an answer. She'd spent so long just trying to survive, just trying to make it through one more day without being crushed or erased, that she didn't know what else there was. She didn't know what she was fighting for beyond the basic animal need to keep breathing. The days blurred together into an exhausting routine. Dessa pushed her relentlessly from dawn until long after sunset. Meditation exercises that left Lyra's mind raw and exposed. Breathwork that seemed simple until she tried it and discovered how much control it required. Visualization techniques that forced her to confront emotions she'd spent years burying. It was excruciating. Every session left Lyra drained, trembling, teetering on the edge of breaking completely. But slowly, painfully, she began to understand. The power inside her wasn't random or chaotic. It responded to intention, to will, to focus. When she centered herself, when she breathed through the fear instead of drowning in it, she could feel the energy shift, bend, respond to her direction instead of overwhelming her. Not perfectly, not completely, not even reliably. But it was a start. And then, on the 15th day, everything fell apart. Lyra was in the training yard working through a breathing exercise with Dessa watching critically when the alarm sounded. A low, bone-deep howl that echoed through the stronghold and reverberated in Lyra's chest. It was followed immediately by others, creating a chorus that sent every wolf into instant, coordinated motion. Dessa grabbed Lyra's arm hard enough to bruise. "Stay close to me. Don't do anything stupid." "What's happening?" Lyra asked, her heart already racing. "Rogue attack," Dessa said grimly, her expression hardening into something cold and dangerous. "A large one, from the sound of it." Lyra's blood ran cold. Rogues were wolves who had been exiled from their packs, or who had abandoned pack life entirely. They traveled in violent, unstable groups, attacking settlements for food, territory, and simple revenge against a world they felt had wronged them. They were unpredictable, often half-mad, and incredibly dangerous. And now they were here, attacking Ravencrest. The stronghold erupted into controlled chaos. Warriors armed themselves with practiced efficiency. Archers took positions on the walls, their bows already drawn. Kyle's voice rang out across the courtyard, issuing orders with the kind of calm authority that only came from years of leading wolves into battle. Lyra stood frozen in the middle of it all, utterly useless. She had no weapons training beyond the basics Dessa had started teaching her. She had no combat experience. She couldn't shift into a wolf to fight alongside the others. She was dead weight, a liability. Exactly what Gareth had warned about. Dessa shoved a blade into her hand, the metal cold and heavy. If anything gets past our lines and comes at you, you use this. Aim for the throat or the heart. Don't hesitate. Understand? Lyra nodded, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the weapon. The battle began with a roar that shook the ground. Rogues poured through a breach in the outer wall. Someone had sabotaged the defenses, Lyra realized with growing horror. They'd had help from inside. The attackers were massive, larger than normal wolves, their bodies twisted and warped by rage and starvation, and something else, something that looked almost like corruption. Their eyes were wild, yellow, and gleaming with madness. Their movements were feral, unpredictable, guided more by instinct and fury than strategy. Ravencrest's warriors met them head-on, and the courtyard became a bloodbath. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The blade felt useless in her trembling hands. She watched as Dessa tore through two rogues with brutal efficiency, her movements precise and deadly. Watched as Kael shifted mid-stride, his wolf massive and black as midnight, easily twice the size of a normal Lycan, his jaws powerful enough to snap a rogue's spine with one bite. And she realized something that made her want to vomit. She didn't belong here. She wasn't a warrior, wasn't a wolf, wasn't anything useful. She was just a girl with a power she couldn't control, standing in the middle of a war she had no business being part of, taking up space and resources that could have gone to someone who could actually fight. A rogue broke through the defensive line. It was huge, its fur matted with blood and filth, its eyes fixed on Lyra with predatory focus. It had singled her out as easy prey, the weak one, the scared one, the one who couldn't defend herself. It charged straight toward her with terrifying speed. Lyra's mind went completely blank. She raised the blade with shaking hands, knowing it was useless, knowing she didn't have the strength or skill to use it effectively. The rogue was going to kill her, and there was nothing she could do about it. The creature leapt, jaws open wide, aimed directly at her throat, and something inside Lyra snapped. Not broke, not shattered, snapped into place, like a bone setting after being dislocated. The power she'd been struggling to control for weeks erupted from her body in a massive wave, not as heat, not as light, as pure, concentrated force. A shockwave of raw energy exploded outward from her center, slamming into the rogue while it was still midair. The impact was like being hit by a battering ram made of solid air. The creature was hurled backward with tremendous force, its body crashing into the stone wall with a sickening crunch that Lyra heard even over the chaos of battle. It slid to the ground and didn't move again. Lyra stared at her hands, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps that bordered on hyperventilation. What had she just done? The battle around her had frozen. Every wolf, Ravencrest warriors and rogues alike, had stopped fighting and was staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to fear to something that looked disturbingly like hunger. And then the whispers started spreading through the courtyard like poison. Spirit-born. She's dangerous. Out of control. Unstable. She could kill us all. Lyra's chest tightened until she couldn't breathe. She looked desperately at Kael, searching for reassurance, for guidance, for anything that would tell her she hadn't just made everything worse. But his expression was unreadable, his silver eyes fixed on her with an intensity she couldn't interpret. And in that moment, Lyra realized with crushing certainty that she had just proven every fear the wolves of Ravencrest had about her. She was dangerous, unpredictable, powerful in ways she didn't understand. A weapon that didn't know which direction it was pointing or who it might destroy next. The rogues, sensing weakness and confusion in their enemies, renewed their attack with fresh fury, and Lyra stood in the middle of the chaos, her hands still glowing faintly with residual energy, trembling as the world burned around her and wolves died because she existed. The rogues surged forward again, emboldened by the confusion rippling through Ravencrest's defenders, but Lyra couldn't move. She stood frozen in the center of the courtyard, her hands still glowing faintly with residual energy that pulsed in rhythm with her racing heartbeat, staring at the broken body of the rogue she'd killed without meaning to, without understanding how. A voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Lyra, move!" It was Dessa, already engaging two rogues simultaneously, her blades flashing silver in the firelight. But she couldn't reach Lyra. No one could. The battle had shifted, lines breaking and reforming, and Lyra was suddenly isolated in a pocket of space that felt both empty and suffocating. Another rogue saw the opening, saw her standing there, vulnerable and terrified, and decided she was easy prey worth claiming. It charged. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to do something, but her body wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed by fear and the horrifying realization that she'd just killed something with power she didn't understand. The rogue was 10 feet away. 5. And then Kyle was there. He moved with impossible speed, his massive black wolf intercepting the rogue mid-leap. The collision was brutal, violent, a tangle of teeth and claws and raw power that ended with the rogue's neck snapping like dry wood. Kale shifted back to human form in a blur of motion, his eyes finding Lyra immediately. "Can you do it again?" he demanded, his voice urgent but not unkind. Lyra shook her head frantically. "I don't know how I did it the first time. I didn't mean to. I can't." "Yes, you can." Kyle moved closer, positioning himself between her and the ongoing battle. "You felt threatened. Your power responded. That's instinct. Now you need to make it intentional." "I don't know how." "Then figure it out fast." His voice hardened. "Because in about 30 seconds, we're going to be overrun, and you're the only thing that might be able to turn this." Lyra looked past him at the courtyard. He was right. There were too many rogues, and they kept coming, pouring through the breach faster than Ravencrest's warriors could cut them down. Bodies littered the ground, mostly rogues, but some defenders too. The air stank of blood and smoke and fear. They were losing. And Kyle thought she could stop it. "I can't," Lyra whispered. "I'm not strong enough. I'm not—" "You are exactly what you need to be," Kyle interrupted. "Stop telling yourself you're powerless. You just sent a full-grown rogue flying 20 feet through solid stone. That's power. Use it." "But what if I hurt someone? What if I can't control it and Then we die anyway," Kyle said bluntly. "At least this way we have a chance." He shifted back to wolf form and threw himself back into the fight, leaving Lyra alone with his impossible demand echoing in her head. Use it. But she didn't know how. The power inside her was still there, still humming beneath her skin, but it felt wild and dangerous, like trying to hold lightning in her bare hands. When it had erupted before, it had been pure instinct, pure terror, forcing it to the surface. How was she supposed to do that on purpose? A scream cut through her spiraling thoughts. Lyra's head snapped up. One of the younger warriors, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, had been separated from her unit. 3 rogues circled her, toying with her, enjoying her fear. No one was close enough to help her. She was going to die. And Lyra was just standing here, paralyzed, useless. "Stop telling yourself you're powerless." Kale's words echoed in her mind. "You are exactly what you need to be." Lyra looked at her hands, at the faint glow still visible beneath her skin, pulsing like a second heartbeat. She thought about Iron Peak, about spending 20 years being told she was nothing, about her brother's cold dismissal, about the pack members who had looked through her like she was invisible. She thought about Alar's chamber, about the agony of the test, about the voice that had told her to let go. And she thought about the girl who was about to die because Lyra was too afraid to try. Something inside her shifted, settled. Lyra closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for that place where the power lived. It was easier to find this time, like a well-worn path through darkness. She touched it tentatively, and it surged toward her touch like it had been waiting. She didn't fight it, didn't try to control it or contain it. She just asked, "Please, help her." The power responded. Lyra's eyes snapped open, and she extended her hands toward the rogues surrounding the young warrior. The energy flowed out of her in a focused stream, this time. Not an explosion, but something more precise, more controlled. It hit the three rogues simultaneously, lifting them off their feet and slamming them into the wall with enough force to leave cracks in the stone. They didn't get back up. The young warrior stared at Lyra with wide, shocked eyes. Then she raised her blade in a salute of thanks and threw herself back into the fight. Lyra's breath came in gasps, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from exhilaration. She'd done it, on purpose, with intention, and she could feel the power settling back into her body, no longer fighting to escape but waiting, ready, responsive. Around the courtyard, other wolves had noticed. Dessa appeared at Lyra's side. Blood splattered across her face, her expression fierce and approving. Again, the ones breaking through on the east side. Lyra didn't question, didn't hesitate. She turned, found the cluster of rogues Dessa indicated, and released another controlled burst of energy. They fell like wheat before a scythe. "North wall," Kale's voice rang out. Lyra spun and struck. "Behind the armory," Gareth shouted, and Lyra could hear the surprise and respect in his voice. She struck again, and again. Each time it became easier, more natural. The power flowed through her like water finding its course, responsive to her will, shaped by her intention. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting. The tide of battle turned. With Lyra systematically eliminating the rogues who broke through the defensive lines, Ravencrest's warriors were able to push forward, to reclaim ground, to drive the attackers back toward the breach. Kyle fought at the front, his massive wolf cutting through enemies with brutal efficiency. Dessa moved like a ghost, appearing wherever she was needed most. Gareth coordinated the defense with shouted orders that cut through the chaos, and Lyra stood in the center of it all, her hands glowing steadily now, a beacon of power that no longer terrified her. She was still afraid, still uncertain, still trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, but she wasn't powerless. Not anymore. The battle lasted another 20 minutes before the rogues finally broke. The survivors fled back through the breach, howling in retreat, leaving their dead scattered across the courtyard like broken dolls. Ravencrest's warriors didn't pursue. They were too exhausted, too bloodied, too focused on securing the breach and tending to their wounded. As the last rogue disappeared into the forest, a cheer went up from the defenders. It started small, tentative, then grew louder, more certain, rolling across the courtyard like thunder. They had won. Lyra sank to her knees, her entire body shaking with exhaustion. The glow faded from her hands, the power retreating back into whatever place it lived inside her, and she felt suddenly, devastatingly empty. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd used the power that had terrified her and turned it into something useful, something that had saved lives instead of destroying them. Footsteps approached, and Lyra looked up to find Kyle standing over her. He'd shifted back to human form and was bleeding from a dozen wounds, but his eyes were clear and proud. "You did well," he said simply. Lyra laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. "I didn't know what I was doing." "Neither does anyone their first real battle," he extended a hand. "But you figured it out when it mattered. That's all anyone can ask." Lyra took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her legs felt like water, barely able to support her weight. Around them, other wolves were approaching. Their expressions were complex, layered with emotions Lyra couldn't fully parse. Respect, wariness, gratitude, fear, but not contempt. Not anymore. Gareth pushed through the crowd, his scarred face smeared with blood and ash. He stopped in front of Lyra and studied her for a long moment. Then he inclined his head, a small gesture, but unmistakable in its meaning. Acknowledgement, respect. "I was wrong about you," he said gruffly. "You're not a liability. You saved lives today." Lyra didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long being dismissed that having someone like Gareth, someone who had openly opposed her presence, admit he was wrong felt surreal. "I just did what I could," she managed. "You did more than most." Gareth turned to address the gathered wolves. "This girl, this spirit-born, fought for us today, bled for us, used power that terrifies her to protect people she barely knows. That's worth more than 100 warriors who fight just for glory. More nods, more murmurs of agreement. The young warrior Lyra had saved pushed forward. "You saved my life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was dead, and you didn't even know me, but you saved me anyway." "I couldn't just watch you die," Lyra said quietly. "Most would have," the girl replied. "Most would have protected themselves first, but you didn't." She pulled something from around her neck, a leather cord with a small carved wolf charm, and offered it to Lyra. "This was my mother's," she said. "She died defending Ravencrest 2 years ago. I want you to have it, as thanks, and as proof that you belong here." Lyra's throat tightened. "I can't take this. It's yours." "It's a gift," the girl insisted. "Please." Lyra took the charm with trembling fingers. It was warm from the girl's skin, worn smooth with age and love. "Thank you," she whispered. The girl smiled and melted back into the crowd. One by one, other wolves approached. Not all of them. Some still watched from a distance with suspicion or fear, but enough came forward to offer words of thanks, nods of respect, gestures that said she had earned her place through blood and courage. Lyra felt something inside her chest crack open, some wall she'd built to protect herself from caring, from hoping, from believing she could ever belong anywhere. These wolves weren't her pack. Not yet. Maybe never. But they saw her. They acknowledged her. And that was more than she'd ever had before. The wounded were being carried to the healing halls, and the dead were being laid out for proper rites. Lyra wanted to help, but her body was shutting down from exhaustion. Dessa appeared and threw an arm around her shoulders, half supporting, half dragging her toward the main building. "Come on, hero," she said with a tired grin. "Let's get you cleaned up before you collapse in the middle of the courtyard and make everyone panic." "I'm not a hero," Lyra protested weakly. "Tell that to the people whose lives you saved." Dessa's voice softened. "You did good today, Lyra. Really good. I'm proud of you." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. No one had ever said they were proud of her before. She didn't realize she was crying until Dessa wiped a tear from her cheek. "None of that," Dessa said gently. "Save the tears for later when you're alone and can really let it out. Right now, you need to let them see you strong." Lyra nodded, blinking back the moisture, and straightened her spine as much as her exhausted body would allow. They were almost to the entrance when Alara appeared, her storm-gray eyes sharp and assessing as always. "Interesting performance," she said. Lyra tensed, waiting for criticism, for some cutting remark about what she'd done wrong. But Alara surprised her. "You controlled it," she said. "Not perfectly, not precisely, but well enough to make a difference. That's progress." "I still don't really understand it," Lyra admitted. "You will." Alara's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The fact that you used it to protect others instead of just yourself tells me everything I need to know about your character. Power reveals who we are. Yours revealed someone worth training." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "Your mother would have been proud," she said quietly. Lyra's breath caught. "You knew my mother?" "I knew of her." Alara's eyes held secrets. "The spirit-born bloodline has been tracked for centuries, even when we thought it was extinct. Your mother showed signs but never awakened. She died before anyone could be certain. Did she know? Did she know what I might be?" "I believe she suspected." Alara's voice was uncharacteristically gentle. "Why else would she have given you her talisman, the stone you carried for so long? That was spirit-born tradition, passing protection from mother to daughter." Lyra thought about the smooth gray stone she'd left behind in Iron Peak. She'd thought it was just a rock, just a memory, but it had been more. A legacy. A message. "You are not broken. You are not worthless. You carry something precious. Get some rest," Alara said. "Tomorrow, your real training begins." And then she was gone, leaving Lyra standing in the doorway with Dessa's arm still around her shoulders and her mind reeling with revelations. The next few days passed in a blur of recovery and adjustment. The breach in the wall was repaired. The wounded were tended. The dead were honored in ceremonies that left Lyra hollow and aching, even for rogues she'd killed in battle. Taking a life, even to save others, left marks that wouldn't wash away. But the stronghold began to look at her differently. Warriors nodded when she passed. Younger wolves watched her with something approaching admiration. Even the servants who had once avoided her now offered small smiles and respectful greetings. She wasn't invisible anymore. The weight of that visibility was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Kael summoned her on the fourth day after the battle. She found him in his private study, a room she'd never been allowed to enter before. It was smaller than she'd expected, lined with books and maps, dominated by a massive desk carved from dark wood. He gestured for her to sit. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Lyra considered lying, saying she was fine, but something in his eyes told her he'd see through it. "Overwhelmed," she admitted, "exhausted, confused, grateful, terrified. All of it at once." Kael nodded. "That's normal. Battle does that. Power does that. Change does that." Everyone keeps calling me a hero," Lyra said quietly, "but I don't feel like one. I feel like I barely survived." "Heroes usually do." Kael leaned back in his chair. "The ones who feel like heroes are usually just arrogant. The ones who understand how close they came to failing are the ones worth following." Lyra picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Why did you really bring me here? It wasn't just to give me a choice. You could have done that anywhere." Kael was silent for a long moment. "Because I saw something in you that reminded me of myself," he said finally. "Someone told they were worthless, told they didn't belong, forced to be small to make others comfortable." His silver eyes met hers, and I wondered what would happen if someone like that was given the chance to become what they were always meant to be. And what am I meant to be? "I don't know," Kael said honestly. "Neither do you. That's the point. You get to figure it out without someone else deciding for you." Lyra felt tears prickling at her eyes again and blinked them back furiously. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when no one else did." "Don't thank me yet," Kael said, but his voice was warm. "The hard part is just beginning. You've proven you can use your power in a crisis. Now you need to learn to use it with precision, control, understanding. That's going to take years, not weeks." "I'll do whatever it takes. I know you will." He pulled out a map and spread it across the desk. "Which is why I want you to attend the Council Summit next month." Lyra blinked. "What?" "The Northern Territories hold a summit every year. All the major pacts send representatives. It's political theater mostly, but it's also where alliances are formed and broken." Kael tapped a location on the map. "I want you there as part of my delegation." "But why? I'm nobody." "You're a spirit-born," Kael said firmly. "The first confirmed awakening in 300 years. That makes you very much somebody. And I want the other packs to see that Ravencrest isn't afraid of what you represent, that we've chosen to embrace it instead of destroy it." Lyra's stomach twisted with anxiety. "You want to use me as a political statement." "I want to use you as proof that power doesn't have to be feared," Kael corrected. "That different doesn't mean dangerous. That the old ways of hunting down anyone who doesn't fit the mold are exactly that, old." He looked at her intently. "This is your chance to show the entire North that you belong. Not because someone gave you permission, but because you earned it. Because you're strong enough and brave enough and worthy enough to stand beside any wolf in this room." Lyra's hands trembled. "What if I fail? What if I lose control in front of everyone?" "Then we'll deal with it," Kael said simply. "But I don't think you will. You've already proven you can control it when it matters. Now you just need to believe in yourself as much as I do." Lyra looked down at the map, at the location marked for the summit, and felt the weight of possibility pressing down on her. This was her chance to step fully into the light, to claim a place in a world that had spent her entire life telling her she didn't deserve one. It was terrifying. But for the first time, it was also exciting. "Okay," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'll do it." Kael smiled, and it transformed his usually severe face into something almost warm. "Good," he said. "Then let's make sure you're ready." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Lyra's life. Dessa's training intensified, focusing not just on control, but on precision and endurance. Lyra learned to direct her power in increasingly complex ways, creating barriers, generating focused bursts at multiple targets, even sensing disturbances in energy around her. Alara worked with her on the theoretical aspects, explaining spirit-born history and philosophy, teaching her meditation techniques passed down through ancient texts, helping her understand the nature of the power flowing through her veins. Even Gareth contributed, teaching her strategy and battlefield awareness, how to read a fight, and anticipate what would be needed before the moment arrived. And Kael oversaw it all, pushing her when she needed pushing, offering quiet encouragement when doubt threatened to overwhelm her. Slowly, painfully, Lyra began to transform. Not into a wolf, she would never have that, but into something else, something uniquely hers. Her body grew stronger from the training, her mind sharper from the lessons, her confidence deeper from the repeated small victories that accumulated like drops of water filling a vessel. She began to walk differently, speak differently, carry herself with a quiet assurance that came from knowing what she was capable of. The wolves of Ravencrest noticed. The whispers changed from fearful to respectful, from suspicious to curious, from contemptuous to admiring. Not everyone accepted her. Some still watched with distrust, still saw her as a threat that would eventually need to be eliminated. But more wolves than not had come to see her as an asset, a protector, someone worth having on their side. On the night before they were scheduled to leave for the summit, Lyra stood alone on the eastern wall, looking out over the forest stretching endlessly into darkness. She thought about Iron Peak, about Elric and the life she'd left behind. She wondered if they'd heard about the battle, about what she'd become. She wondered if her brother regretted exiling her, or if he was relieved to have the embarrassment finally removed from his territory. She found that she didn't particularly care either way. That realization was perhaps the most profound change of all. She'd spent 20 years desperately wanting her brother's approval, her pack's acceptance, some sign that she was worth loving. But she didn't need that anymore. She'd found something more valuable. She'd found herself. Couldn't sleep? Lyra turned to find Kyle approaching, his footsteps silent on the stone. Too much thinking, she admitted. He joined her at the wall, looking out at the same darkness. Nervous about tomorrow? Terrified, Lyra said honestly. What if they reject me? What if they demand you get rid of me? What if they won't? Kyle interrupted gently. And even if they tried, I wouldn't listen. You've earned your place here, Lyra. Not because I gave it to you, because you fought for it, bled for it, became strong enough to claim it. Lyra's throat tightened. I still don't understand why you have so much faith in me. Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because someone once had faith in me when I didn't deserve it. When I was weak and broken and convinced I was worthless. They saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and they gave me the chance to become more. What happened to them? They died, Kyle said quietly, defending me from wolves who thought I was too dangerous to live. But before they died, they made me promise something. What? To pay it forward, to find someone else who needed that chance and give it to them. His silver eyes met hers. You're not the first person I've offered sanctuary to, Lyra, but you're the first who's fully embraced what it means, the first who's turned potential into power. Lyra didn't know what to say to that, so she simply stood beside him in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, and felt something settle inside her chest. Peace. Not complete, not permanent, but present. For the first time in her life, Lyra Vane felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And tomorrow, she would prove to the entire Northern Territory that a wolfless girl from a forgotten bloodline could stand among the strongest wolves in the land, not as a curiosity, not as a mistake, but as an equal. The council summit was held in neutral territory, a sprawling stone fortress built into the side of a mountain range that marked the boundary between the northern and eastern territories. It had stood for centuries, weathered and ancient, a monument to the uneasy alliances that kept the wolf packs from tearing each other apart. Lyra had never seen so many wolves in one place. They filled the great hall to capacity, alphas and their delegations from every major pack in the north, plus representatives from the southern territories, and even a few from the distant western clans. The air was thick with competing scents, dominance displays barely contained by the thin veneer of diplomatic courtesy. She stood with Ravencrest's delegation near the entrance, trying to make herself small out of habit, but Kyle's hand on her shoulder stopped her. Stand tall, he murmured. You represent Ravencrest now. Act like it. Lyra straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and met the stares that came her way with as much composure as she could manage. The whispers had already started. News of the Spiritborn traveled faster than she'd expected. Every eye in the room had found her within minutes of their arrival, assessing, judging, calculating what her presence meant. Some looked curious, others hostile. A few seemed almost hungry, like predators who'd scented interesting prey. Dessa moved closer to Lyra's left side, her hand resting casually on her blade. "Stay between me and Kael," she said quietly. "Don't respond to provocations. Don't engage unless someone speaks to you directly. And whatever you do, don't let them see you afraid." "I'm terrified," Lyra admitted. "Good. Use it. Fear sharpens the senses." Dessa's amber eyes swept the room. "Just remember, half these wolves would kill you if they thought they could get away with it. The other half want to use you. Trust no one except our own." The session began with traditional formalities, acknowledgement of territories, recitation of ancient treaties, the usual political theater that meant everything and nothing. Lyra tried to pay attention, but her focus kept drifting to the faces in the crowd. She was searching for one in particular, though she told herself it didn't matter if he was here. And then she saw him. Elric. Her brother sat with the Iron Peak delegation, looking exactly as she remembered. Sharp-featured, coldly handsome, radiating the kind of confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. Seraphine sat beside him, her crimson dress replaced by midnight blue, but her predatory grace unchanged. Their eyes met across the crowded hall. Elric's expression flickered with something Lyra couldn't read. Surprise, maybe, or calculation, before settling back into careful neutrality. He'd heard then. He knew what she'd become. Lyra looked away first, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much his presence still affected her. The formal proceedings continued until midday, when the council broke for a meal. It was during this informal gathering that the real politics happened. Private conversations in corners, alliances negotiated over wine, threats disguised as friendly advice. Lyra stayed close to Kael, trying to be invisible again, but it was impossible. An alpha from the Eastern Territories approached, a massive man with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. "So this is the Spirit-born everyone's talking about," he said, his voice carrying just enough to attract nearby attention. "She doesn't look like much." Kael's expression didn't change. "Appearances can be deceiving, Marcus." "Can they?" The alpha, Marcus, circled Lyra slowly, assessing her like livestock. "I heard she killed 3 rogues during the Ravencrest attack. Impressive, if true, but I also heard she can't shift, can't fight properly, can't hold her own in a real challenge." "She held her own well enough," Kael said calmly. "Against rogues," Marcus said dismissively. "Hardly a measure of real strength. Any trained warrior could do the same." Lyra's hands clenched into fists, but she kept her expression neutral, her breathing even. This was a test. She could feel it. "You doubt the reports?" Kael asked. "I doubt the exaggeration," Marcus corrected. "Stories grow in the telling. A spirit-born sounds impressive until you realize it's just a girl who got lucky with some parlor tricks." Several other alphas had drifted closer, drawn by the confrontation like sharks to blood. "Parlor tricks," Kael repeated softly. "Interesting characterization." "Prove me wrong," Marcus turned to Lyra directly. "Show us what makes you worth all this attention. Demonstrate this legendary spirit-born power." Lyra's heart hammered. This was exactly what Dessa had warned her about, being baited into a display that could go wrong, that could be used against her. But if she refused, she'd look weak, afraid, everything they expected her to be. She looked at Kael, searching for guidance. He gave the slightest nod. "Your choice." Lyra turned back to Marcus and met his challenging stare. "What would you like to see?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Marcus smiled. It wasn't a kind expression. "Something measurable. Something that proves you're more than just an anomaly Kael is protecting out of sentiment." He gestured to a large stone urn standing against the far wall, easily 300 pounds of carved granite. "Move that," he said, "without touching it. If you're truly spirit-born, it should be effortless." The hall had gone quiet. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned to watch. Lyra looked at the urn. She'd never tried to move something that heavy before. Her training had focused on combat applications, barriers, bursts of force, defensive maneuvers. Telekinesis wasn't something she'd practiced, but she couldn't back down now. She took a slow breath, centering herself the way Dessa had taught her. She reached for the power inside, felt it rise to meet her touch, responsive and ready. Please, she thought, just this once. Help me. She extended her hand toward the urn and focused her will. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Marcus's smile widened. As I thought. The urn lifted off the ground. Not smoothly, not gracefully. It wobbled and shook, and Lyra could feel sweat breaking out across her forehead from the effort. But it rose, inch by inch, until it hovered 3 feet in the air, suspended by nothing but her will and the power flowing through her veins. The hall erupted in whispers. Lyra held it for 10 seconds, an eternity, before lowering it carefully back to its original position. The moment it touched down, her knees buckled. Dessa caught her before she could fall, steadying her with strong hands. Parlor trick? Kyle asked Marcus mildly. The Eastern Alpha's expression had shifted from dismissive to wary. Impressive, he admitted grudgingly, but lifting objects isn't the same as combat effectiveness. Then perhaps you'd like to test that personally, Kale suggested, his voice taking on an edge. Marcus hesitated. Challenging Kale Draven directly was suicide, and everyone knew it. That won't be necessary, a new voice interjected. Lyra's stomach dropped. Elric had approached, Seraphine gliding at his side like a crimson shadow. Her brother looked at her with an expression she couldn't parse. Part curiosity, part calculation, part something that might have been regret if she didn't know better. Hello, Lyra, he said, the casual use of her name as if they were still siblings, as if he hadn't exiled her and promised to kill her if she ever returned, made anger flare hot in her chest. Alpha Vane, she said coldly, giving him his title and nothing more. Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe. Or just annoyance at being reminded of what he'd done. I heard you've been making quite a name for yourself, Elric continued smoothly, defending Ravencrest, awakening an extinct bloodline. It's remarkable what you've accomplished in such a short time. Is there a point to this conversation? Kyle asked, his tone dangerous. Just curious about my sister's well-being, Elric said. We may have parted on difficult terms, but blood is blood. You exiled her, Kyle said flatly. You declared her dead to your pack. You don't get to claim blood ties when it becomes politically convenient. Elric's expression hardened. I did what I had to do, what the pack required. Lyra was wolfless, Lyra interrupted, finding her voice. Broken, an embarrassment. Yes, I remember all the reasons you gave for erasing me. You didn't give me much choice, Elric said. You defied me, in front of everyone. You made me look weak. I said no, Lyra corrected. I refuse to be humiliated for your political theater. That's not the same as defiance. To an alpha, it is. Then maybe that's the problem. Lyra took a step forward, and to her satisfaction, Elric took a small step back. Maybe the problem is alphas who think saying no is the same as declaring war, who think anyone who doesn't submit completely is a threat that needs to be eliminated. Seraphine's hand moved toward her belt, but a warning growl from Dessa stopped her. Careful, Seraphine said softly. You're speaking to an alpha. I'm speaking to my brother, Lyra said. The same brother who spent 20 years pretending I didn't exist, who let the pack treat me like garbage, who threw me away the moment I became inconvenient. I gave you shelter, Elric said, his voice rising slightly. Food, protection, more than most would have given a wolfless. You gave me a cage, Lyra interrupted, and you called it mercy. Then you exiled me for refusing to thank you for it. The confrontation had drawn every eye in the hall. The political implications were enormous. A wolfless exile publicly challenging an alpha, accusing him of cruelty, doing it in front of the entire Northern Council. Elric's face flushed with anger. You have no idea what you're talking about. You don't understand pack politics, pack survival. I understand that strong packs don't need to crush their weakest members to feel powerful, Lyra said. I understand that real strength comes from protecting everyone, not just the ones who make you look good. You think you understand strength now because you have some parlor tricks? Elric's voice dripped contempt. You're still the same weak, powerless girl you always were. You've just found someone willing to use you. The only one using anyone here is you, Lyra shot back. You're trying to reclaim me now because having a spirit born in the family is politically valuable, because suddenly I'm worth something in your calculations. But I'm not playing that game anymore. You don't have a choice. I have every choice, Lyra said firmly. That's what you never understood. I always had choices. You just made sure I was too afraid to make them, but I'm not afraid anymore. Elric's eyes flashed gold. His wolf was rising, responding to the challenge in her words. You dare. Yes, Lyra said simply. I dare. I dare to stand here and tell you that you were wrong, that the way you treated me was cruel and unjust, that you failed me as a brother and as an alpha. And I dare to walk away from you without your permission or approval because I don't need either anymore. The silence in the hall was absolute. No one breathed, no one moved. A wolfless nobody had just publicly denounced an alpha, had called him cruel and unjust to his face, in front of the most powerful wolves in the territories. It was unthinkable, unprecedented, potentially fatal. Elric's hands trembled with barely controlled rage. You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was spending 20 years believing I needed you to tell me I was worth something, Lyra said. I know my worth now, and it has nothing to do with you. She turned her back on him, a deliberate insult, a statement that he no longer had power over her, and walked back to Kael's side. Her legs shook, her heart raced. Every instinct screamed that she'd just signed her own death warrant, but she'd done it. She'd faced the person who had spent her entire life making her feel small, and she'd refused to be small anymore. Kael's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and grounding. When he spoke, his voice carried across the silent hall. Anyone who wishes to dispute Lyra's place in Ravencrest can take it up with me personally, he said. Anyone who sees her as a political tool to be claimed or controlled should understand that she is under my protection, and I take threats against my people very seriously. The threat was clear. Touch her, and you answer to the Lycan King. One by one, the alphas in the room nodded acknowledgement. Even Elric, after a long moment of visible internal struggle, inclined his head. It wasn't acceptance, it wasn't approval, but it was recognition. Lyra Vane had just forced the Northern Council to see her as a person with agency, with power, with the right to determine her own path. The rest of the summit passed in a blur. Formal sessions continued, treaties were negotiated, territories disputed and resolved. But the real story, the thing everyone would remember, was the wolfless girl who had publicly challenged an alpha and lived. Lyra spent the remaining days in a state of anxious exhaustion, waiting for retaliation that never came. Elric kept his distance. Other alphas watched her with new wariness, new respect, new calculation. She'd become a political force whether she wanted to or not. On the final night of the summit, there was a traditional ceremony, a symbolic joining of the packs under the full moon, a reminder that despite their differences and conflicts, they were all wolves, all connected by ancient bonds. Lyra stood at the edge of the gathering, watching as the alphas in their inner circles shifted into wolf form and ran together through the forest surrounding the fortress. She couldn't join them. She would never be able to. But for the first time, that didn't feel like a loss. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Dessa approaching, 2 cups of wine in her hands. Not joining the run? Lyra asked. Someone needs to keep an eye on you, Dessa said, offering her a cup. Make sure you don't do anything else dramatic. Lyra laughed, accepting the wine. I think I've had enough drama for one lifetime. Doubtful, Dessa said, but her tone was warm. You're the kind of person who attracts dramatic situations. Might as well get used to it. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, sipping wine and watching the distant shapes of wolves moving through the trees. What you did today, Dessa said quietly. Standing up to your brother like that took guts. Or stupidity, Lyra said. Sometimes they're the same thing. Dessa's amber eyes reflected moonlight. But it needed to be said. He needed to hear it. They all did. I'm not sure it changed anything. It changed you, Dessa said, and that's what matters. You stopped being the person they told you to be and started being who you actually are. That's worth more than any political victory. Lyra felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back. Thank you. For everything. For training me. For believing I could do this. I didn't believe anything, Dessa said bluntly. I just gave you the tools. You're the one who used them. Don't give me credit for your courage. Another set of footsteps approached, and Kael materialized out of the darkness. Mind if I join you? He asked. Dessa handed him her cup. I was just leaving anyway. You two have things to discuss. She disappeared back toward the fortress, leaving Lyra alone with Kyle under the moonlight. You didn't shift, Lyra observed. Neither did you, Kael pointed out. I can't. I can. I chose not to. He looked at her intently. You know why? Lyra shook her head. Because I wanted you to know you're not alone in standing apart, he said. That choosing a different path doesn't mean you're broken or wrong. It just means you're different. Lyra's throat tightened. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. Kael's voice softened. What you did today, confronting Elric, claiming your worth in front of everyone, that was one of the bravest things I've ever seen. It was terrifying. The brave things usually are. He paused. I'm proud of you. The words hit Lyra like a physical blow, knocking loose something that had been lodged in her chest for years. She started crying. Not delicate tears, but ugly, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Kael pulled her into an embrace, and she buried her face in his shoulder, letting years of pain and fear and loneliness pour out of her in waves. I'm sorry, she gasped between sobs. I don't know why You're releasing, Kael said gently. Letting go of everything you've been carrying, it's okay. Take as long as you need. So she did. She cried for the little girl who had never shifted, who had spent her 13th birthday locked in a room waiting for a transformation that would never come. She cried for her mother, who had died trying to protect her from a world that saw her as worthless. She cried for all the years of invisibility, of silence, of making herself small so others could feel big. And she cried for the person she used to be, the one who believed all the terrible things they said about her. When the tears finally stopped, she felt hollow, but clean, like a wound that had been lanced and could finally begin to heal. Better? Kael asked. Lyra nodded, pulling back and wiping her face. Better. They stood in silence for a while, watching the moon climb higher in the sky. What happens now? Lyra asked eventually. Now you decide, Kael said. You've proven yourself, earned your place. You can stay at Ravencrest, continue your training, become part of the pack formally. Or you can go somewhere else, forge your own path. The choice is yours. Lyra considered this. A month ago, she would have been terrified of having choices, of the responsibility that came with freedom. But now? Now she understood that freedom was the only thing worth having. I want to stay, she said, but not as someone you're protecting, as an equal, as someone who contributes. Kael smiled. Done. We'll formalize it when we return to Ravencrest. And Elric? What if he comes after me? He won't, Kael said with certainty. You embarrassed him too publicly. If he retaliates now, he looks weak and vindictive. Better for him to pretend the whole thing never happened. And the other packs? The ones who see me as a threat? Let them, Kael said. Fear breeds respect. As long as you continue to prove you can control your power, use it responsibly, they'll accept you. Grudgingly, maybe, but they'll accept you. Lyra nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her new reality settling over her shoulders. She was no longer invisible, no longer powerless, no longer the mistake everyone wished would disappear. She was Lyra Vane, spirit-born of Ravencrest, and she had claimed her place in a world that had tried to deny her one. They returned to Ravencrest 3 days later. The journey was easier this time, with Lyra riding her own horse instead of clinging to Kyle's back. She'd learned enough in the past weeks to manage the basics, and the physical independence felt significant. As they crested the final hill and saw the stronghold rising from the mountainside, Lyra felt something unexpected. Relief. Gladness. A sense of coming home. Ravencrest wasn't where she'd been born. It wasn't where she'd spent her childhood or where her family history lived. But it was the first place that had ever felt like it might become home. The gates opened to admit them, and wolves poured out to greet the returning delegation. The reception was warmer than when they'd left. News of the summit had traveled fast, and the wolves of Ravencrest were proud that one of their own had faced down an alpha and won. Lyra dismounted and found herself immediately surrounded by well-wishers. The young warrior whose life she'd saved during the rogue attack pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around Lyra in an enthusiastic hug. "You did it," she said. "Everyone's talking about how you stood up to your brother, how you proved Spiritborn aren't something to fear." "I just told the truth," Lyra said, but she couldn't help smiling. "Sometimes the truth is the bravest thing," the girl said. Over the next few weeks, Lyra settled into a new rhythm. Her training continued, but with a different focus now. She wasn't just learning to control her power. She was learning to refine it, to understand its nuances and possibilities. Alara worked with her on the spiritual aspects, teaching her meditation practices that connected her to the earth, to the energy that flowed through all living things. Lyra learned to sense disturbances before they became threats, to read the intentions of those around her through subtle shifts in their energy. Dessa continued combat training, but now it was about integration, how to use her spirit-born abilities in combination with physical fighting, how to create openings for allies, how to be part of a coordinated defense. And Kael taught her politics and strategy, preparing her for the role she would inevitably play as Ravencrest's spirit-born representative. But beyond the training, Lyra found herself simply living. She made friends among the younger wolves, shared meals in the Great Hall, helped with repairs and preparations for winter, participated in ceremonies and celebrations. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't other. She was just Lyra, and that was enough. 3 months after the summit, on a cold morning when frost painted the windows silver, Lyra stood before the assembled pack in the Great Hall. Kael had called a formal gathering, though he hadn't told her why. Now standing in front of hundreds of wolves, she felt nervousness flutter in her stomach. Kael rose from his seat at the head table, and the hall fell silent. 3 months ago, he said, his voice carrying easily, I brought someone to Ravencrest who had been rejected by her birth pack, who had been told her entire life that she was worthless because she couldn't shift, who had been invisible and powerless and erased. He gestured to Lyra. But we've learned something important in these months. We've learned that power takes many forms. That strength isn't just about teeth and claws, that the old ways of judging worth are exactly that, old and often wrong. He descended from the dais and approached Lyra. Lyra Vane has proven herself in battle, in diplomacy, in courage. She's earned her place here not through bloodline or tradition, but through her own merit. And today, I want to make that official. He pulled out a silver pendant on a leather cord, the symbol of Ravencrest, a wolf howling beneath a crescent moon. Lyra Vane, Kael said formally. Do you accept membership in Ravencrest Pack? Do you swear to protect its people, honor its laws, and stand with us against all threats? Lyra's vision blurred with tears. This was it. The moment everything changed. I do, she said, her voice steady and clear. Kael placed the pendant around her neck. Then by my authority as Lycan King and Alpha of Ravencrest, I declare you Pack. You are one of us. You belong here. The hall erupted in howls, the traditional wolf song of acceptance and celebration. Lyra couldn't howl back. She didn't have a wolf to lend its voice, but she lifted her hands and let her power flow out, not as a weapon, not as a tool, but as expression. Light bloomed around her, warm and golden, spreading through the hall like dawn breaking over mountains. And in that light, every wolf could feel what she felt: joy, gratitude, belonging. The howls grew louder, more exuberant, and Lyra stood at the center of it all, finally, completely, undeniably seen. Later that night, after the celebrations had died down and most of the pack had dispersed, Lyra found herself back on the eastern wall where she'd stood so many nights before. But this time, she wasn't alone. Dessa stood on her left, arms crossed but smiling. Gareth on her right, the scarred warrior who had once called her a liability, now looking at her with something approaching paternal pride. Alara behind her, the High Counselor's usual severity softened by approval. And Kael beside her, his presence steady and grounding as always. How does it feel? Kael asked. Lyra touched the pendant at her throat, feeling its weight and meaning. Like I can finally breathe, she said. She thought about the girl she used to be. Small, frightened, convinced she was broken. She thought about the stone she'd carried for years, the one she'd left behind in Iron Peak because she didn't need it anymore. She thought about all the people who had told her she was worthless, who had looked through her like she was invisible, who had treated her existence as an embarrassment to be hidden. And she smiled. Because they'd been wrong. She wasn't worthless. She'd never been worthless. She was just different. And different wasn't wrong. It was powerful. In the distance, dawn began to break over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Lyra watched it rise, this new day in her new life, and felt something she'd never truly felt before. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of someone drowning and grasping at straws, but the solid, unshakable hope of someone who knew their own strength and trusted themselves to face whatever came next. She was Lyra Vane, spirit-born of Ravencrest, once invisible, now undeniable, once powerless, now powerful beyond measure, once broken, now whole. And this was just the beginning. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow and possibility, and Lyra breathed it in deeply, feeling it fill her lungs and her heart, and every empty space that had once been filled with shame and fear. Behind her she could hear the stronghold coming to life, voices calling to each other, the clang of the forge starting up, children laughing as they raced through the courtyards. The sounds of a pack, her pack, the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. Kyle's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Ready for what comes next?" he asked. Lyra smiled, her eyes still fixed on the sunrise painting the world in new light. "Ready," she said, and she meant it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, political maneuvering, territorial disputes, wolves who would always see her as a threat or a tool, she would face them. Not as the scared girl who had sat invisible in the corner of Iron Peak's great hall, but as the woman who had learned to stand in the light and claim her power without apology. The world had tried to make her small, had tried to convince her she was nothing, had tried to erase her, and she had refused. She had stood up, had fought back, had proven that worth wasn't determined by whether you fit someone else's definition of normal. She had become exactly who she was always meant to be. And in doing so, she had changed everything. Not just for herself, but for every wolf who came after her, every outsider, every misfit, every person who had been told they were broken because they were different. She had proven that different could be powerful, that rejection could become transformation, that the invisible could become undeniable. The sun cleared the mountains fully now, flooding the valley with golden light. And Lyra Vane stood tall in it, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, no longer the mistake everyone had wanted to forget. She was the beginning of something new, a force that would reshape the old order, a light that refused to be dimmed. She was free. She was powerful. She was home.